this latest edition of Talk About London, a podcast about how to make the capital city a better place. I'm Leanne Tritton, Chair of the London Society, one of the UK's oldest charitable civic societies.
And I'm Dave Hill, publisher and editor of the journalism website onlondon.co.uk.
If you live in the UK, you'll be familiar with the endless stream of anti-London sentiment in politics, the media and public debate. Despite being the economic engine of the country, London is often portrayed as a problem for Britain rather than an asset. But what does the rest of the world actually think about London?
Our guest today is Professor Greg Clark, who quite literally travels the world advising cities on how to thrive. For over 4 decades, he has worked with ministers, investors and urban leaders from New York to Sydney, from Barcelona to Bogota. And he has chaired boards and committees in more than 20 major cities, including London. Few people have a better sense of how cities see each other and how London fits into that global picture. So welcome, Greg.
It's really great to be here, Dave, and thank you, Leanne. Lovely to see you both.
Great. Well, I'm going to start with the first question, and it's the core question. What does the world really think about London?
Leanne, to answer this question, I think I've got to say firstly, I'm lucky enough to have visited 400 cities around the world. Whenever I go to a city, people say to me, "Where are you from?" And then they want to talk about London. And London is a city that almost everybody has an opinion on. Almost everybody thinks they know London. They know one aspect of it or more. And everybody is curious about London. So I think that's the first thing we need to note. London is probably one of the best known cities in the world, maybe even the best known city in the world. And it's known variously for its history and its heritage, its culture, its tourism, its education, its sport, its business, its film, its TV, its media, its music. And it has some very long-term advantages that people are aware of. It's been a leading city in the world for almost 500 years. The advantages of history and the confidence that comes from history, the time zone, the English language, the approach to law and codification, the business, the connectivity that London has. And all of this, of course, is due to a history of empire, a role in the Industrial Revolution, what happened to London during World Wars I and II, and much more that we're going to describe, including London's decline and then London's revitalisation in the second part of the 20th century. And so London is an exciting city for people around the world because they know it's a city of moment. It's a city with a lot of purpose. And they're very interested in how London has performed this revitalisation and recovery that is the story of the last 50 years. So overall, I think what we have to say is London is a popular city, London is a recognised city, London is a city with a deep sense of history, and people are aware of that, and that history is part of global history. But London is also then a city that has surprised people in the last 50 years with its revitalisation, its global leading role in finance, in culture, creative industries, in media, in sports, its growing population, its globality and cosmopolitanism. And overall, it's then therefore London's sort of scale and influence, its soft power, its talent, its rules of engagement. All of those things are the things that the world knows London for.
Brilliant. And you've actually painted a picture which is much more positive than the narrative that we normally hear when you're a local, when you're a Londoner. Pardon?
Isn't that always the way?
Always the way.
You're never a hero in your own land, and the global view of London is different to the UK view of London, and I'm sure we're going to come on to that.
Yes, and so, but before we get on to the sort of positive sides, obviously, what do sort of other cities see as a negative with London? I mean, a lot of the things that we've heard about recently is, Brexit has meant, no one's coming to London, COVID, all of these other things, our current political system or situation, I should say, with the change of prime ministers. We've had many prime ministers over the last couple of years. Does that actually matter to anyone, or are they all in other cities all suffering from the same problems?
No, they're not suffering from the same problems, and London's challenges, I think, are quite unique. If we just go back over the last 20 years, of the three big shocks, and two of them you've mentioned, I would like to add the global financial crisis to that. I would say the global financial crisis, Brexit and COVID have all impacted on London in very particular ways. The global financial crisis really burst the balloon of globally traded financial services. It caused massive public debt. It ushered in periods of austerity. It left huge numbers of people all over the world without homes to live in because mortgages were defaulted on or were lost. And as a consequence, I think the damage to London was quite severe, because it took what was then our leading industry and it gave it a kind of reputational damage. So I think that's very clear. Brexit, I think, was damaging for London in very practical ways. It reduced our access to EU workers, particularly EU talented mobile workers, young workers. It also took the UK out of the Erasmus programme, which prevented young people from easily coming to study in the UK who were EU nationals. That reduced the European nature of the London talent pool and the labour force. And it also, I think, was a very abrupt way of saying actually London and the UK are closed to EU talent. And of course there have been secondary effects from all of that, where people from Barcelona or Milan or anywhere else who might have tried to come and study or work in London are now doing it instead in Berlin or Amsterdam or Stockholm or elsewhere. So there has been a kind of a consequential effect from that. And then with COVID, I think what COVID did to London was, firstly, I think we have to say that London's sort of bounce back has been very strong. But as you know, it's been led much more by culture and leisure and consumption than it has been by work. But COVID had a kind of sorting effect. And the sorting effect it had was in the labour market and the housing market, where it encouraged many more people to think that you can have a job in London where if you only have to commute part-time, you can live in a different housing market. And one of the consequences of that, of course, has been the loss of school-aged children in London. And London now has a kind of demographic challenge, which is that there are many fewer young people living in London. So there are different kinds of consequences from the GFC, from Brexit and from COVID. And I'd like to talk a bit more about Brexit later on. But in terms of international perceptions of London, which is where we're anchoring this conversation, I think what it has demonstrated is three things that are difficult. Firstly, it's become clear in the international media that London has not enjoyed unanimous support from the UK government over the last 15 years. So if you like, it has detached London from UK government, and people scratch their heads when they see that, say, why is the UK government not supporting its capital city? Something must be terribly wrong in the UK. That's point number one. Point number two, I think, is that because of all of the challenges put together, London's costs have become much clearer, and although people still like to visit London because it's possible to enjoy a trip to London, the idea of moving to London is now tarnished by the reputational disadvantage around the costs, particularly housing costs. And then the third area where there is some kind of longer term risk is, if you like, London's openness somehow coupled with ideas about London's personal safety. So if you read the New York Times or Le Monde or El País or any of the international newspapers that cover London, stories about crime and insecurity are quite high at the moment in terms of perceptions. Now, I don't think that these things eradicate London's long-term story of being a safe haven for people, for money, for privacy, for identity, London as a place where you can be yourself. I think that still stands. But if you like, there are new doubts being cast on some of that in the current moment. The good news always for London is because we've been a pretty successful city off and on for about 400, 500 years, there is a perception that we will generally bounce back. So a problem in London would have to persist for several cycles before the global balance of opinion would really turn against us.
Great. Just on a couple of things there. So the housing issue and the cost and affordability of housing, isn't that not the same though for every major city? I mean, most major cities are very expensive to live in, and so does that actually stop investment into London or stop people coming, or do they factor it in? And then the second issue about the sort of crime reporting that is going on. There's a bit of I just want to sort of challenge on that, or some of the things I read about. First of all, London is high crime rate for small crime, and violent crime, but also you're seeing a lot of news coming out of the US in particular, saying that a lot of high net worth individuals are coming to the UK because of what they perceive as a negative infrastructure or political environment in the US. So it's sort of a bit of everything, isn't it? It's hard to pinpoint exactly what's happening with these sort of high net worth individuals that every city seems to be trying to attract.
Okay, so there's three different points there, Leanne. I just want to do one at a time.
Sorry, I'm jet lagged, Greg.
Yeah,
so
it
all comes at you at once at the moment.
So firstly, on the housing issue, yes, every successful city has an affordable housing crisis unless they've got some kind of brilliant policy. And I think we're going to talk a little bit later about Singapore and Vienna and a few other places, right? So it is understood that if you're a successful city these days, population growth in successful cities is exceeding housing supply growth in successful cities, and that's leading to unaffordability. However, in London's case, you've also had a very high level of private investment into housing in the recent periods of regeneration, the last two cycles. And there's a bit of a perception that real estate assets in London are still slightly overpriced, even though housing prices are actually coming down in London, as people will be aware. So it's a bit of a mixed set of opinions about that. And you've also got the perception that it's hard to build new housing at scale in London. If you like, the idea is that we've done all the easy regeneration projects in London over the last three cycles, starting way back with Covent Garden in the mid-1970s. We've done the easy regeneration cycles, and the next ones are going to be difficult. So there is a bit of a perception that London's slightly saturated, it's difficult to invest. We have to present the next cycle of projects, and many of them are going to be in zones 3, 4 and 5 and 6 for all the reasons that I think we understand. So that's that on housing. On the perceptions of crime, I think this is just an issue that bad news stories from other cities sell column inches, as it were, or get more of the attention economy. So they are telling the story, particularly the recent story about phone thefts in London, right? Mm-hmm. So if you read the New York Times for the last 3 months, you'll read 5 or 6 stories about the phones being stolen on the streets in London and how they're ending up in China and being rebought in a market in Shenzhen. And then you'll see that being picked up in the Straits Times and in the Times of India and elsewhere. So there's media reporting about this. But I think you're right that, if you like, London's getting a reputation for a high level of petty crime, not so much in the high levels of crime, but other cities have done quite well in cracking down on petty crime. So the question is, can London do as well as New York has done in that space, for example? And then lastly, your point about high net worth individuals. Well, of course, it's very dynamic, very mobile set of people, and you will have people who want to leave the US and choose to come to the UK because they want to work within a similar business climate and culture, but within a different political regime. And those, of course, are different from the people who want to leave the UK to go to Dubai or Singapore because they want to do a business of a different kind. So you'd have to net off all of the different kinds of movements. But for sure, London has a safe haven status. And what that means is if you're in an environment which is highly volatile for whatever reason, and you're looking for a safe place to go from which you can continue to conduct your global activities, whatever they may be, London's always going to be on your shortlist.
Right. Safe haven cities. What are the safe haven cities alongside London that you would see that we're competing with?
Well, generally speaking, a safe haven city is a place where it's safe to deposit your capital because the rules of disclosure and safety and security, property rights and other things are secure. It's safe to educate your children because they're going to be able to enjoy a good standard of education and a civilized environment. It's unlikely that there'll be a really, let's call it wide swinging regime change over a period of time. Rule of law is respected, and it's possible for you to conduct global activities from there. And historically, of course, the cities for which this was true were what we used to call the big four of the global cities: London, New York, Paris and Tokyo. They've recently been joined by others, Singapore, Seoul, to a certain extent. You could argue that Sydney and Dubai are now coming into this environment, possibly as well as New York. You could say there's a certain version of this in San Francisco and in Los Angeles, and an emerging version in Miami. We've recently seen Toronto becoming one of these kinds of cities. In real estate terms, they're often called the global gateway cities, but they're actually cities with a safe haven approach. And of course, depending upon what part of the world you live in, it might be that you live in a region where Dubai is your safe haven within the region, because it's the region that's got the most socially progressive regime, and therefore it's possible to be yourself in Dubai but still be living in that part of the world. And you might find something similar in Mumbai if you're from India. So it's this interesting combination of the safety and security of your assets and your family, plus this freedom of expression, freedom of identity approach, that this live and let live thing, which I think is really London's middle name, as it were. It's the live and let live city, going all the way back to 1067 and the deal that was done between the burghers of the city of London and the new King William, after the Norman conquest. So London's got that live and let live approach. Other cities have been trying to emulate that, both at a global level and at a regional level.
Brilliant.
That was so interesting. I was very struck by your remark earlier, Greg, saying that I think you were speaking about overseas media, but perhaps it's broader than media, a sense that national governments in this country have sort of gone off the capital city. Now, so I'm thinking back to not very long ago, the 2012 Olympic Games and the build-up to that, when London, as the sort of exemplar global city, 300 languages spoken, extraordinarily multicultural mosaic, was seen as a huge asset. This was our selling point to try and become the city that was chosen to host the 2012 Games. We had Ken Livingstone, the Mayor of London, from the far left tradition of British politics, marching shoulder to shoulder with a Conservative Party politician, Sebastian Coe, as two of the great figureheads of the Olympics challenge and the successful Games. And this was backed by the Games was backed by Tony Blair's Labour government and then by the Conservative-led coalition that followed. Everybody seemed to agree that London was this fabulous thing for Britain. And yet, 12, 13 years later, nobody wants to seem to have anything to do with us. Why is that?
Well, I think there are some good reasons, Dave. I'm really glad you've put the question like that. Let's just start by saying all of this cycle that you're referring to, I think 2012 was the kind of end of a couple of cycles, or one big cycle that really began in 1991 with the publication of the London World City Report. This was the UK government for the first time saying, London's not just our capital city, it's actually a world city. And because it's a world city, its competitiveness matters to the whole nation. And because its competitiveness matters to the whole nation, we need to do some things about this. We need to fix the transport system. We need to improve the governance. We need to promote London more. And you could argue that from 91 through to about 2012, both by the John Major government and then by the Tony Blair and the Gordon Brown governments, that broadly that policy was followed. And so London was promoted as a world city. We were pleased we had one. There were only 4 in the world, and that having a world city meant that you had a big cluster of well-paying jobs in a narrow set of sectors, and the benefit of that was big tax revenues that you could export to the Treasury to provide public services in the rest of the nation. The problem with that thesis, I think, was very clear, that it required the rest of the nation to accept that there was only going to be one really productive region in the country. We were only going to specialise in a narrow range of industries around which we thought we had a competitive advantage: finance, business services, media and information. And we were going to ask the rest of the country somehow to be dependent upon the fiscal outflow that was going to come from having this narrowly concentrated kind of economic superpower in the southeast of the country. And I think that what that did was to store up resentment, disappointment, frustration with other cities and regions around the country, knowing that they also had economic potential that wasn't being prioritised and exploited. And then when the global financial crisis occurred, and this is why I think it was such a big thing, and in a way a bigger shock than either Brexit or COVID, it kind of pulled the rug from under that whole deal, and it exposed it for what it was, which was, although, great expertise in finance and professional services is an important thing to have, actually it was very costly to resolve that crisis. So I think what that did, Dave, was to unleash, as it were, permission to say, actually, there were certain risks with all of that model. And then I think, obviously, the second thing that has happened since then is that on Brexit, London, broadly speaking, had a different view from many other parts of the rest of the country. And on COVID, in fact, I think one of the effects of COVID has been to relatively speaking, advantage London again, relative to other cities and regions in the country, because the returns to scale and the returns to diversity post-COVID have been greater. So London has been performing relatively better in certain aspects than other parts of the country have. So that's why that deal broke down. But I think that what you could say very clearly is that the leadership was not particularly agile at the national level at the time. There wasn't enough thinking about how the whole country could become more productive, and there were some clear lessons and failures there. By the way, it's very clear around the world that the global financial crisis has proved to have been a very important departure point from a couple of cycles where it appeared that globalization in these advanced services was having the effect of lifting all regions in the countries that had them, versus the period afterwards where it appears that having globalization in financial and professional services benefits much more the cities and regions that host them, and there isn't so much spread across or positive spillover from that, and that's led to the whole debate about the left behind cities, regions and towns, not just in the UK but around the world.
Okay, so this is a debate, let's use a polite word for disagreement, vicious disagreements that I sometimes have with people from the north of England, and they say, it's not fair, London gets everything, we're left out. If you gave it to us, we would become much more successful and productive, just like you are. And I say, if only it were that simple. If you penalise, and this is what all the mayors of London say, this is what Boris Johnson used to say, Sadiq Khan says it as well, and I say to them, okay, it's important that the rest of the country is supported and helped with infrastructure spending and so on, and I agree that the dependency on London is too great. But if you penalise London precisely because of that dependency, where's the investment for Andy Burnham's new railways going to come from? It's not going to come from Manchester. So how do we get? So we have this rather circular argument. Placing that issue in the broader context of this discussion, Britain wanting growth and wanting investment from overseas and so on, If you were in charge, Greg, how would you deal with what has become perceived as the London problem in terms of UK productivity and its importance on the global stage?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that this is a common debate in many other countries where you've got a large city that is a kind of primate city within that country. So you have a version of this with Stockholm in Sweden. You've got another version of this, of course, with Dublin in Ireland at different scale. There's a version of this with Seoul in South Korea, and there's a version of this with Buenos Aires in Argentina, or with Auckland in New Zealand. And it's the same dynamics within the discussion about, well, do you try to have one place that's going to be globally competitive, or are you trying to kind of spread the opportunity? All of this is sort of rife with zero-sum and binary thinking that doesn't really make any sense. I think the truth of the matter is, if you've got a big agglomeration like London with 9 million residents in a region of 24, 25 million residents, you've got to try to optimize that in terms of its global competitiveness. But you've also got to optimize the performance of your wider system of cities. You've got to be able to enable Birmingham and Manchester and Leeds and Newcastle and Liverpool, and very importantly Edinburgh and Glasgow and Belfast and Cardiff and many other cities. You've got to really have effective strategies for enabling them to grow, to fulfill their potential, and to become specialised places. And we are beginning to see that happen. Manchester has been one of the fastest growing digital economies in Europe for the last 10 years. Glasgow's reinvention as a city of discovery and engineering and creativity is really very palpable. It's just that they're at a much smaller scale than London. We, I think, need many more of those. And the problem is basically this, that I think the economic relationships between all of our cities are ones of win-win, but the public finance relationships between our cities are ones of win-lose. So there's something wrong in our public finance system that says, we're only going to invest a certain amount. Now, there's a big debate about all of this, Dave. You'll be all aware of this. We have to change the way we invest. We have to change the source of our investment. And we have to make it clear that every place has the possibility to have its own sort of economic destiny invested in, and we're not trying to make some places simply dependent upon fiscal transfers from others.
Okay, thank you very much. And just sort of going back a bit into the point you made about a perception overseas that UK governments, including the current one, somewhat to the disappointment of Sadiq Khan, have sort of gone off London a bit. Is that a bad thing to be doing? What should the current government, let's talk about the current government, be doing differently? How should it change its attitude to London in order to improve Britain's reputation across the world?
Well, I'm not sure it needs to do something differently. I think it needs to do a lot of things better. And, I'm somebody who thinks that the new National Industrial Strategy is basically a very good document. I think the new National Infrastructure Strategy is a good document. I think what we need to do is really get on the front foot with these things, which I believe will show that it's possible for London to succeed at the same time as Birmingham and Manchester and Sheffield and Leeds and Newcastle and Liverpool and Cardiff and Glasgow and Edinburgh and Belfast. We need all of these cities to succeed. And I think we now have the framework of ideas around which that can occur. But what we've got to do is put some heft behind it, because here's the point that most preoccupies me, Dave, on my travels. I used to think of London as having perhaps 3 or 4 real competitors in the world. I now think of London as having 50 or 60. I used to think of Manchester as being a leading, knowledge hub city in Europe, and indeed it is, and it still is. But it now faces competition from parts of the world it never faced competition from before. And I think that Brexit in particular made it difficult for our cities outside of London to compete in the way they used to for international talent. And so I'm really keen that we get this new youth mobility scheme
Yeah.
in place very quickly. That's going to be very important for all of our cities. But I think there's also a sense in which we need to use our soft power much more precisely. You know, the part of the soft power that the UK has is this. We, for all our faults and for all our checkered history, we were the first country to industrialise. Because we were the first country to industrialise, we were the first country to have industrialised cities. Specialist cities in different locations, in a network with different kinds of industries being done in each, from steel to cotton to coal to shipbuilding to everything else. Because of that, we have an incredible patchwork of cities around this country that have great industrial histories and innate capabilities, and they have fantastic universities, they have brilliant sports clubs, they have civic identities and cultures that are very distinct and very profound. And that gives us a huge amount of soft power, whether it's the music that we've produced in Glasgow and Sheffield and Liverpool, or it's the football clubs that people follow around the world that are based in Birmingham or Manchester, or whether it's the quality of our universities, which are broadly spread around our country. We need to start building a real sense of momentum around those innate capabilities, which are the inheritance of having been the first nation to industrialise, the first nation to deindustrialise, and the first nation to figure out how to regenerate after that. And I think that's the story that we don't tell enough.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you one final tabloid question before handing you back to Leanne. So is it correct to say that London bashing is bad for Britain?
But London bashing is definitely bad for Britain, but so is Manchester bashing, Glasgow bashing, Cardiff bashing, Liverpool bashing. I worry about much more than London bashing. I think we've bashed Liverpool far too much. So, yes, look, bashing your own cities is a bad thing in any country, and it's particularly a bad thing for us because we have a challenge we have an appetite to be a really successful country, but we've got to marshal our capacity to do that in a much more coherent way. So bashing anyone's not a good idea. By the way, we're not the worst at this. The Australians are much worse than us. If you go to any Australian city and try to say anything positive about any other Australian city, it's more or less a fist fight outside. So be aware that we're not the only country that suffers from this problem.
Very good moment for me to hand back to Leanne. Thank you, Greg.
Well, I just returned from Australia, and I can assure you that's exactly what's happening. And I was, you chat with Australians, you sit in great restaurants drinking fabulous wine, and they tell you how bad life is, and it's like you ain't seen anything. Get a grip. Can I come back again, a bit tabloidy like Dave, and this is on the soft power question, because, I arrived here from Australia in 1995, and there was an amazing sense of achievement and optimism in the UK. I mean, there was the Blair government coming in, there was Cool Britannia, there was a wave of great films and all sorts of other things, bands and everything else. But there was certainly, everybody seemed to be going out and talking the country up. Now, how important is it to have individuals who have that sort of charisma to be able to sell us internationally, to bring in, to lift the idea of the country. Now, obviously, the monarchy, now, I don't want to get into a Republican debate, but the monarchy is pretty powerful in that soft diplomacy. And we've seen that recently with Donald Trump and that sort of thing. But, do we just lack, is everybody a bit dull in the UK? Who are our salesmen now going out and saying we're great?
Well, I accept it's a bit of a tabloid question, but I think that I can't really give you a tabloid answer. I think you've described very well, Leanne, that we did have a big burst of energy that happened at around the period of the millennium and led up to the Olympic Games, as Dave was explaining earlier. And during that time, whether you call it Cool Britannia or whether you call it, the emergence of Britpop, or whether it was preparing for the Olympic Games, there was a sense in which our soft power through cultural and creative industries and our soft power through sport and through convening was really at a high level, and it did create, of course, some jealousy, not least in France, and obviously they feel that they've got their own back now. Look, we are living in a much more global world, and we are at the beginning of a new cycle, which is a rather complex cycle because it's not yet clear whether this is going to be short or long. It's not yet clear where new consensus could be about what's right. But I think the areas where we should be taking a lead are not so much on the cultural production, although we continue to do that extraordinarily well. And if you look at everything from theatre to music to dance to literature, you will discover that either people from the UK or people now live in the UK are great leaders in this space. And we need to continue to promote that. But I think that there's a desire now for our leaders to also be people who are not just creative, but are also solving some of the bigger challenges that we have in the world. So Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the internet, a man from the UK, has talked a lot about the importance of a cyber secure future, and that's very important. Things that we're doing at the level of our cities, but also at the level of our energy with certain companies that have really become some of the global leaders in sustainable energy. I think that's going to be very important. I think our universities and our education system continues to be considered as world class, and I think our educational leaders deserve more spotlight. So maybe this next cycle is not so much about the celebrity endorsement, but maybe it's about doing things that really fix the social contract that we have with the British people, and at the same time generate ideas and solutions that are seen as credible in other countries. I think that's probably the way we make progress now, by doing the right things, not just having the right spokesperson saying the right things, if I can be really simple about it.
Yeah, so as you speak, and glancing at my notes, what you've just said has sort of brought to mind this phrase that's used by a variety of people, including the current Mayor of London, this idea of the London promise, the city of opportunity and freedom, where you can be yourself and you can do stuff that you wouldn't be able to do anywhere else. It's really quite difficult to make the case now that that promise is being kept, or can be kept for as many people as it used to be, as, for example, when I sort of drifted up to the capital city in 1979, when London was in a bit of a grubby state, to be frank, compared with where it is now. But there were things the things I wanted to do with my life, there was nowhere else to come and do them, and I was able to do them. And it's just very, very difficult to it's partly a consequence of the success of the city as an economic engine, I guess, that its economic growth has to some extent driven high house prices, or we haven't found the policies to deal with that problem. So I suppose I'm asking, again, looking at from this sort of international perspective as we are, that sense of the London promise, is that something that is eroding a bit in the eyes of people elsewhere in the world?
Well, I think actually, Dave, the challenge you've just described, and by the way, I remember 1979 in London very well. I had an amazing time in London in 1979, but that's not for this podcast. But the London promise, I think that you're basically right here, that if you like, there is a London promise, and it does date back to 1067 in my view. It's live and let live, and it's that you can come to London, you will be allowed to be yourself. There's this gorgeous balance between privacy and anonymity with opportunity and creativity, which means that people who come here get to do the things that they weren't able to do in the places that they came from. And that's also part of this safe haven, but also this enabling sort of environment. And I think what has happened is that with housing supply not keeping up with population growth, with financialization in the housing sector as well, it's become more difficult for people to come to London for an entry-level opportunity, knowing that that entry-level opportunity might lead to a ladder of further opportunity. And if you like, there are more snakes than ladders now than there were in 1979 on that board. So that is the challenge. But the core promise that London is a place where individuals can fulfill their talent and where good ideas can be scaled up and where we can take people from very different parts of the world, put them together and make some magic. That promise still exists. I just think that the bandwidth of people who can benefit from that has narrowed, and that's why tackling affordability, tackling housing supply, increasing and improving, the transport system so that people can live in bigger geographies but still be part of London, and doing that in a way that also tackles some of the bigger existential crisis, including the climate crisis, is really very important. And that's why we've got to fix those kinds of fundamentals for the promise to ring true. Dave and Leanne, I think you've given us a compelling proposition as to why people's perceptions of London have become more negative or more constrained or more disappointed in the last period. But I think I need to tell you that I don't think this is any different from the conversation that has been happening in New York or in San Francisco or in Paris, and to a certain extent in Tokyo, somewhat in Hong Kong. There are different dynamics going on in Seoul and Singapore and Dubai who are benefiting from a new spurt. To some extent, Leanne, you might find this kind of conversation happening in Sydney. So maybe there's a conversation happening here about, how London is not fulfilling its promise, which is actually a part of a broader conversation about our expectations of cities have become very, very high. But our ability to deliver the solutions that enable cities to continue to provide what we aspire to them to provide has been much more constrained. So I think we're living through a period where we all have high expectations of the cities where we live, and every city is struggling to deliver on that. And that's what I think this conversation says. You had asked me if I wanted to say something about where I would place some priority in London, given the international view. And I think there are some things. We've talked about housing and sustainability, housing affordability, safety. Those are reputational things that are very important. But three things we haven't mentioned that I want to talk about is that I do think it's really essential that the EU Youth Mobility Programme is agreed. I think you will find that will make a big difference, not just to London, but to the rest of the UK and its regions. Having European talent back in our country and back in our cities, both at the student level and at the young worker level, is going to be really critical. And for any of us who are parents, giving our young people the chance to study in a European university or to have an early stage job in another European city, I think is really key. The second one is the Greater South East. We haven't said much about this, but London is a metropolitan core of 9 million people in a region of 25 million people. We need to organise that 25 million person region in a way that doesn't run counter to the conversation we've already had about the rest of the UK. But we are not organising the economic region of which London is a part, and there are big risks for all of that. We see that happening much better in New York or Singapore or Paris with the Ile-de-France and everything else. And then lastly, I just don't think we talk enough about the River Thames. And if I were making recommendations about what to do.
Okay.
Just so you know, Greg, we ran a talk, the London Society, about 2 years ago, I think it was, Dave, where we talked exactly about London and the South East and changing the boundaries to reflect that as a larger economic area.
Thank you very much, Greg, for joining us.